If you'd told me that I could be married for 17 years and only feel like a real wife for the first 7, I would have laughed. I would have said that kind of half-life only happens in bad soap operas, not in real families with real children and a mortgage and PTA meetings. But here I am, 47 years old, technically still someone's wife. And yet I've been living like a ghost tenant in my own marriage for a decade. My name is not the important part of this story. What matters is this. 10 years ago, I caught my husband cheating on me with multiple women while our youngest son was still in diapers. And instead of begging for forgiveness, instead of even pretending to be sorry, he looked me in the eye and suggested an open marriage like he was offering me a new phone plan. Maybe this is the solution for us, he'd said. We can both see other people, stay married for the kids, no drama. No drama. I remember standing there in our kitchen, one hand on a bottle warmer, the other still shaking from what I'd seen, the lingerie in a stranger's living room, the confusion in that young man's eyes when he realized my husband had a whole family at home, the smell of baby formula and betrayal mixing in my throat until I thought I might choke. I didn't agree to an open marriage. I did something worse. I agreed to stay. We split the house instead of the marriage. He took the downstairs, the master bedroom, the shared memories, the life we used to have. I moved upstairs into the guest room with my own tiny kitchen, a little library, and a terrace that felt more like a lookout tower in a war I hadn't chosen. We raised our sons under one roof, smiled at school events, posed for family photos, and behind all of that, we lived separate lives. He cycled through women. I cycled through exhaustion, resentment, and the kind of numbness that makes you forget what it feels like to be touched by someone who actually loves you. I told myself I was staying for the kids. I told myself I was strong. I told myself this was temporary. Then, 10 years later, I met him, a younger colleague who looked at me like I was still allowed to want more from life than quiet suffering and shared custody schedules. And the moment my husband realized I had finally found someone who loved me for real, the man who had demanded freedom for a decade, completely lost his mind and tried to destroy the only chance at happiness I'd had in years. That was the day I realized. The marriage might have died 10 years ago, but the real war was just beginning. If you asked me what kind of woman I used to be before my marriage fractured, I could tell you in one sentence. I was someone who believed loyalty was the highest currency a person could offer. Not beauty, not ambition, not money, loyalty. I'm 47 now, but 17 years ago, I was a 20-something woman who thought love could weather anything. I worked in engineering back then. Analytical, structured, predictable, the opposite of the emotional chaos my life would later become. My husband, Daniel, was studying psychology when we met in college. He was charismatic in the way men studying human behavior often are, soft-spoken, attentive, always knowing the right moment to tilt his head, to ask a question, to make you feel seen. He made me feel understood in a way no one else had. We married young, right after graduation. We built a life together brick by brick. Our first apartment, our first joint bank account, long nights spent talking about the future we wanted. When our first son was born, I cried more out of gratitude than exhaustion. When the second came unexpectedly, I laughed and cried at the same time. Life felt messy, but full. But looking back now, the cracks were already forming. I just didn't recognize them. Daniel liked admiration. He needed validation, the way some people need caffeine to get through the day. Compliments from coworkers, attention from strangers, praise from students he counseled. These things lit him up. I mistook that for charm. He also loved being the center of emotional gravity, pulling people in with stories about growth, relationships, purpose. Meanwhile, I handled logistics, schedules, school forms, doctor's appointments, budgeting, the quiet things that hold a family together. I mistook that for balance. After our second son was born, the shift happened slowly at first. Daniel became distant, tired, distracted. He stopped initiating intimacy, stopped asking about my day, stopped meeting my eyes for more than a heartbeat. Every time I asked what was wrong, he blamed work stress, the baby, exhaustion. I believed him because I wanted to. And because I was raised in a family where you stayed. You endured. You kept the peace. When he shrugged off my concerns, I swallowed my discomfort. When he dismissed therapy, I said maybe he was right. When he came home late, I told myself he deserved time to decompress. When the loneliness crept into our meals, our bed, our conversations, I pushed it aside for the sake of stability. I mistook that for love. He still showed up as a father. He still played with the boys, still helped with homework sometimes. That made it even easier to rationalize the growing distance. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't cold, just absent in the most intimate ways. Then, slowly, new patterns emerged. He guarded his phone more. He showered as soon as he came home. He volunteered for more late counseling sessions. He changed colognes. He bought new shirts without telling me. He became angry when I asked innocent questions. And because I didn't want to be the paranoid wife, I told myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. The day I followed him changed everything. But the truth is, the foundation had been rotting for years. I just didn't see it. Or maybe I did. And I chose to look away, hoping the man I married would eventually return. I didn't know then that the version of him I loved was already gone, and the version I'd live with for the next decade was someone entirely different, a man who demanded freedom for himself and control for me. A man who would watch me suffer in silence, but unravel the moment I found someone who made me feel alive again. Looking back, the signs weren't subtle. They were neon red warnings I painted beige so I could keep pretending everything was fine. The first real fracture happened 4 months after our youngest was born. I remember standing in the kitchen, the dishwasher humming, the smell of formula faint in the air, when Daniel pulled away from my touch like my hand had suddenly become too hot. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside, grabbed his phone, and walked away. A tiny moment, a tiny rejection, but it lodged itself under my skin. From there, the distance unfolded like a slow-moving avalanche. He stopped resting his hand on my back when he passed behind me, stopped kissing my forehead at night, stopped joking with me during dinner, stopped noticing when I dressed up or wore perfume, stopped reaching for me in bed. Every day, something small slipped through the cracks. I didn't want to admit that what we had was eroding, so I tried to compensate. I cooked his favorite meals. I planned small outings for us. I suggested therapy gently, then firmly, then tearfully. He brushed everything aside with a tired smile that never reached his eyes. It's just postpartum stress. You're overthinking again. Overthinking. The first word he used that made me feel small. Then came the phone habits. He took it everywhere. Into the bathroom, into the shower, kept it under his pillow at night. If I walked by while he was texting, he angled the screen away. Once, he took a phone call in the backyard in the middle of winter, pacing in the dark for nearly an hour. And yet, I convinced myself I was imagining the worst, because imagining the truth was worse. The emotional withdrawal became physical distance. Nights he didn't come home until after midnight. Weekends where he had urgent work obligations. New shirts, a new watch, a new cologne he didn't tell me about. He never smelled like it at home, but I could smell it faintly on the seatbelt of his car. I told myself, he's just stressed. He's just exhausted. Marriage goes through phases. But then, little by little, people around us started reacting strangely. His mother hinted that men sometimes need space. A coworker of his slipped and asked if Daniel enjoyed late-night drinks with the group, a group he'd never mentioned to me. A neighbor said she'd seen him driving into our cul-de-sac late one night with a woman in the passenger seat, then quickly backtracked when she saw the look on my face. My sister asked if we were okay because Daniel seemed too cheerful lately. Too cheerful. Meanwhile, I was drowning in diapers, sleep deprivation, and a loneliness so sharp it felt like heartbreak every morning I woke up beside a man who wouldn't even reach for my hand. A memory haunts me from that period. One of those subtle moments that changes everything without announcing it. I was holding our baby, patting his back, humming softly. Daniel walked in, paused in the doorway, looked at us. And there was nothing on his face. Not tenderness, not affection, not even impatience, just neutrality. I realized later he had already given himself to someone else, even if his body was still in our home. The night I suggested therapy again, he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Why do you always make things dramatic? Not everything needs fixing." But something inside me whispered, something is already broken. And I was about to discover just how shattered things truly were, because the next time he said he was out with friends, I felt that deep internal click, that instinctual certainty. He wasn't going where he said he was going, and if I didn't follow him, I would drown in the not knowing. The night everything collapsed didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt quiet, too quiet. the kind of quiet that sits in your gut like a warning. Daniel had told me he was going shopping with a coworker, the same coworker whose name kept appearing in his phone at odd hours, the same coworker he claimed was going through a tough time and needed emotional support. He kissed the air somewhere near my cheek, grabbed his keys, and left without looking back. Something inside me, that intuition women learn to sharpen through a lifetime of reading the room, tightened. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't breathe around it. So, after pacing the living room for 15 minutes, I strapped our sons into their beds, texted my sister to come stay with them, and grabbed my coat. I followed him, not because I wanted to catch him, but because I needed the truth to stop gnawing me alive. His car led me across town to a neighborhood I didn't recognize. He parked in front of a beige, single-story home with a dim porch light and a red bicycle leaning against the railing. Not a shopping center, not a coworker's house I'd ever been told about. I watched him walk to the door like he'd done it 100 times. When it opened, a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, pulled him inside by the front of his shirt. I felt the world tilt. For 20 minutes, I sat frozen in my car. My hands shook so violently, I had to hold the steering wheel to steady myself. My heartbeat felt like it was ricocheting off my ribs. Thoughts collided in my mind. Denial, fury, grief, disbelief, all tangled into one impossible knot. Finally, I got out. I walked to the door. I knocked. A shirtless man answered. Not Daniel, not the woman. A man I'd never seen in my life. He blinked at me, confused, then glanced over his shoulder like he was trying to calculate what kind of situation this might be. I didn't wait. I stepped past him, shoving the door aside. And there she was, a woman in lingerie, cheap, lacy, red, standing in the middle of the living room. Her hair was tousled, cheeks flushed, lips parted in the kind of surprise that reveals guilt more clearly than any confession. But the real blow came from the couch. Daniel sat there, shirtless, comfortable, like he belonged, like this wasn't the first time, like this wasn't even the worst thing he'd done. When he saw me, he didn't look shocked. He looked inconvenienced, as if I had interrupted his evening, not uncovered the implosion of our marriage. The shirtless man, apparently another one of her partners, stepped back, looking horrified as the truth dawned on him. "You're married?" he said to her, his voice cracking. No, it's not like that," she stammered, but Daniel cut her off, standing and moving toward me. Except he wasn't moving to comfort me. He was moving to shield her. He put an arm out when I stepped forward. He shielded her. "Don't do anything stupid," he said sharply. Stupid. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to collapse. Instead, I whispered, "How many?" His jaw tightened. "How many women, Daniel?" He said nothing. The silence was the answer. Later, after dragging him home, after an argument so vicious it felt like shards of glass lodged in my throat, after calling his parents who were stunned but not surprised, after staring at my marriage until it looked like a stranger's life, he said the words that would define the next decade of my existence. Maybe we should have an open marriage, to take the pressure off. It might actually help us. I remember the sensation. Not pain, not rage, but an emptiness so vast it swallowed the room. He wanted freedom. He wanted variety. He wanted no accountability. And he expected me to nod, accept, endure. That was the night the marriage died, but the funeral wouldn't come for 10 more years. For days after that night, I moved through the house like a shadow wearing my own skin. I brushed the boys' hair, packed lunches, folded laundry, responded to work emails, all with a hollowed-out calm. The kind that comes when your body is moving, but your soul hasn't caught up yet. Shock has its own gravity. It pulls you inward, compresses you, turns your world into a muffled echo. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel sitting on that couch, the soft lamplight outlining his shoulders, the lingerie-clad woman behind him, the strange man in the doorway looking at me with pity. But the worst image, the one that lodged itself in the center of my chest like a splinter, was Daniel lifting his arm to shield her. Not me, not our family, her. I kept replaying it, unable to decide which part broke me more, the betrayal or the ease with which he chose someone else. My first instinct was to run. My second was to scream. My third was to burn the entire decade down and walk away from the ashes barefoot if I had to. But instead I froze. I stayed silent. I endured. Because the cruel truth was this. I had 2 sons under the age of 2. I had a modest salary compared to Daniel's growing income. And in our state, infidelity wasn't leverage. It was irrelevant. The consultation with the divorce lawyer should have been empowering. Instead, it crushed me. She explained calmly, clinically. Your husband will likely receive primary custody due to the children's ages. You'll owe child support, possibly alimony. You'll need to move out unless you can buy out the house. Her words blurred into a fog. Move out, lose the boys, pay him, start over alone. I left the office with my hands trembling so violently I struggled to open the car door. On the drive home, something inside me collapsed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like a quiet implosion. A private funeral for the life I thought I was building. That night, Daniel behaved as though the confrontation had been a minor disagreement. He made himself a sandwich. He turned on the TV. He didn't look at me once. When he finally spoke, it was without remorse, without hesitation, without any acknowledgement of the damage. An open marriage makes the most sense, he said. We stay legally married, keep the family stable, and we both explore. We both, as if this was a mutual desire, as if I had ever wanted anyone but him. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything or demand explanations. I simply said no, but he pushed. He insisted this would reduce pressure. He insisted this was progressive. He insisted we could eventually reconnect. I told him if he wanted freedom, he could sign divorce papers. He told me I was being dramatic, manipulative, selfish. That night, lying alone in the guest bedroom, a room that would become mine for the next 10 years, I felt the weight of every choice tightening around me. What had I missed? What had I ignored? When had the man I loved turned into someone I didn't recognize? And then came the ugliest question of all. Had he ever been the man I thought he was? But shock eventually gives way to something sharper, something heavier, something that presses you toward action. By the next morning, my silence had hardened into resolve. I would not accept his open marriage. I would not pretend this was normal. I would not let him rewrite our reality to absolve himself. But I would also not risk losing my children. So I made a new decision, not out of surrender, but survival. I would stay, but not as his wife, as a mother, as a protector, as someone who would not let him take everything from me. And without knowing it, that was the first step toward a slow, painful metamorphosis, the beginning of a decade-long unraveling that would eventually lead me to someone who reminded me that I deserved real love. The next months unfolded like a slow-motion disaster, not loud, not explosive, but steady and relentless, the kind of erosion that wears you down grain by grain until you wake up one morning and realize you've become a stranger inside your own life. Daniel took the downstairs master bedroom. I took the upstairs guest room. We told the boys nothing. How could we? They were too little to understand why Mommy and Daddy didn't sleep in the same room anymore. Why Mommy cried in the shower. Why Daddy came home smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. We lived under one roof, but in two separate worlds. At first, I thought he'd slow down, that the shock of almost losing everything would force him to rethink, that he would look at me, at our family, and feel even a flicker of shame. But instead, my refusal to accept an open marriage seemed to ignite something reckless in him. He stopped hiding. The first night he brought a woman home, I was upstairs reading to the boys. I heard laughter through the floorboards, high-pitched, breathy, followed by the distinct thump of a body against a wall. I froze mid-sentence. My older son frowned. "Mommy?" "Keep reading," I whispered, even though he was too young to read on his own. Daniel must have known I was home. He must have known the boys were awake. He must have known I could hear. But he didn't stop. He didn't even try. Later, when the boys were asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of his life continuing without me. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I felt nothing at all, like someone had turned the dimmer switch on my existence all the way down. But after that night, the women became routine. Sometimes they stayed a few hours, sometimes overnight. Once, a woman stayed for nearly a week. I heard all of it. The laughter, the footsteps, the wine glasses clinking, the whispered conversations. I learned the voices of women I never wanted to know. And Daniel? He acted like I didn't exist. Friends and family. His mother checked in a few times, worried about us. I lied to her, not to protect Daniel, but because I was ashamed. Because saying the truth out loud felt like peeling skin from bone. My family noticed I lost weight. No one knew why. I didn't offer explanations. Meanwhile, Daniel crafted a perfect facade. He attended school events, smiled for pictures, helped the boys with homework. He managed to be both the doting father and the man who broke our marriage with surgical precision. People praised him for being such a hands-on dad. I swallowed the bitterness like medicine. Attempts at peace. For the first 2 years, our arrangement felt like walking barefoot on broken glass, every step a small wound. But over time, patterns emerged. We rarely saw each other. He handled the downstairs. I handled the upstairs. We communicated through a shared calendar on the fridge. I started surviving by compartmentalizing. I took the boys to parks, read bedtime stories, built the kind of routine children thrive on. And when they slept, I sat alone on the terrace, letting the night sky hold what I couldn't. Sometimes I heard him downstairs laughing with a woman, and I felt rage, not at the infidelity anymore, but at the audacity, the entitlement, the ease with which he lived his double life. But I said nothing, because silence was the cost of keeping my children. Dating and distance. For years, I didn't date. I couldn't. I felt damaged, unwanted, invisible. Eventually, I tried. There were 2 or 3 casual connections. Men who were kind enough, but my heart wasn't there. I felt like a person renting their own body, unsure of what I wanted or deserved. While Daniel flaunted his freedom, mine tasted like guilt. But something inside me was shifting, slowly, painfully, preparing me for a future I couldn't yet imagine. The first real signs of jealousy. 10 years into our non-marriage, something changed. It started with small comments. "You're going out again? Who's watching the boys? New perfume?" He never cared before. Why now? Then came the interruptions. Sudden, forced reasons to come upstairs, fabricated emergencies with the kids, passive-aggressive critiques of my schedule. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but I wasn't. The man who spent a decade pushing me away was suddenly inserting himself into my space, my routine, my life, like he sensed something shifting and wanted to reclaim territory he'd forfeited long ago. And he was right. Something had shifted. I had met someone. Not yet a romance, but a spark, a warmth, a reminder that I was an entire woman, not a ghost roommate. A reminder that I could still be seen. And Daniel, who spent years pretending not to notice me, suddenly noticed everything. His behavior didn't just escalate, it detonated. Because the second I stopped revolving around his gravity, he couldn't stand it. It happened the night I realized I wasn't just exhausted, I wasn't just lonely, I wasn't just surviving. I was breaking. It was the first time I brought Kathy into my upstairs space, my refuge, my safe place, the only part of the house that still felt like mine. We weren't doing anything intimate. We were sitting at my small kitchen table, laughing over cheap takeout, the boys asleep downstairs, the soft glow of the terrace lights washing the room in gold. For the first time in years, the house felt warm. Then the door flew open. Daniel didn't knock. He didn't even hesitate. He barged in like he had every right in the world to stand in the one place he had left untouched. "Why aren't you answering your phone?" he demanded, breath sharp and uneven. Kathy froze. I froze harder. He stepped inside, sweeping his eyes over the plates, over Kathy's sweater draped across a chair, over the bottle of wine I'd finally felt brave enough to open. "What is this?" he snapped. "A date? In our house?" Our house. The same house he'd turned into a revolving door for his affairs. The same house where I cried myself to sleep alone for a decade. The same house he abandoned as a husband long before I abandoned him in my heart. My voice came out quiet, too quiet. "You agreed to the rules. You stay downstairs. I stay upstairs. You don't come up unless it's about the boys." He exploded. "You're their mother. You don't get to hide up here like some teenager sneaking around with a boyfriend. And you," he turned on Kathy, "this is not appropriate. Not around my children." "Your children." As if they weren't mine too. As if I didn't raise them through every fever, every nightmare, every milestone he missed because he was busy finding himself in other women's beds. The hypocrisy cut so deep I actually felt dizzy. Kathy stood up then, shoulders tense, but voice steady. "I think I should go." Daniel blocked the doorway. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but like a rope that had been stretched too far for too long. "Move," I said. He didn't. "Move," I repeated louder. But Daniel wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at Kathy, like she was an intruder in a home he hadn't emotionally inhabited in 10 years. "This isn't your place," he spat. "You don't get to come in here and—" Kathy grabbed her coat and slipped past him with a strained smile at me. "Call me later." The door closed. Silence fell. And then Daniel laughed. A cold, bitter sound. "You really think she's going to stick around for this mess?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My chest ached, my hands shook, my throat locked. All the anger, grief, and humiliation of the last decade swirled inside me like a storm I could barely contain. Daniel leaned against the counter like he owned the space. You know what your problem is? You overreact. You always overreact. That's why I had to look elsewhere. You couldn't give me what I needed. My vision blurred. There it was. The truth he'd carried all along. The lie he'd made me swallow for 10 years. That I was the problem. That his cheating was somehow my fault. That my suffering was an inconvenience he tolerated. I felt something inside me crumble. Not my strength, but my hope. The quiet, desperate hope I'd been holding on to without even realizing it. That someday he might apologize, acknowledge the hurt, offer closure. He never would. He wasn't capable of it. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't even sound like mine. You don't get to destroy me and then act like you're the victim, he scoffed. Destroy you? You're being dramatic. That was the lowest moment of my life. Not the betrayal, not the loneliness, not even the decade of emotional starvation. It was this. The realization that I had spent 10 years tied to someone who genuinely believed I deserved the pain he inflicted. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the terrace until sunrise, knees pulled to my chest, the cold biting my skin. And for the first time since the separation, I felt truly, terrifyingly alone. Not because Daniel had left me, but because I had finally accepted that he never cared if I stayed or not. And yet, somehow, the moment that broke me was also the moment that cracked something open, the first hint of light after a decade-long night. Because in that darkness, I whispered the words I had been too afraid to say. I can't live like this anymore. The days after that confrontation felt different, not lighter, not easier, but clearer. Like someone had finally wiped the fog off a window I didn't realize I'd been staring through for years. The pain was still there, the humiliation was still there, but something new had arrived too. Resolve. I didn't announce it, I didn't scream or make threats, I just shifted. Daniel sensed it immediately. The first sign came when he tried to come upstairs again, under the guise of asking about the boys' schedules. I met him at the door, blocking his path. You can text me, I said, calm but firm. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in my expression stopped him. For once, he walked away without a word. The second sign came from Kathy. She didn't pull away like I feared she would after that awful night. Instead, she invited me over with a gentle smile that made my throat tighten. She had tea waiting, blankets, a seat beside her on the couch. Tell me everything, she said softly. And I did. Not the polished version I'd given friends, not the carefully curated version I'd told my family. The real version. The painful, jagged truth I'd locked inside my chest for 10 years. Kathy didn't flinch. She didn't blame me. She didn't question why I stayed. She simply held my hand and whispered, "You didn't deserve any of that." Those words, simple, quiet, unwavering, did something to me, like someone had finally switched on a light in a room I thought would always be dark. For the first time in a decade, I believed them. The evidence that changed everything. A week later, I was gathering laundry from the upstairs hallway when I heard a familiar chime from Daniel's phone downstairs, his old backup phone, the one he used before upgrading. He must have been clearing out the downstairs closet earlier, because the phone was charging on the kitchen counter. Normally, I ignored his things, but something compelled me to check it. Not out of jealousy, but clarity. Closure. The phone unlocked easily. He had never bothered changing the passcode. I wasn't looking for proof of cheating. I already had more than enough. But what I found was something else entirely. Screenshots. Dozens of them. Conversations between Daniel and several of the women he'd been seeing. Messages where he bragged about having a wife who didn't care enough to leave. Comments mocking my emotions, my exhaustion, the way motherhood had changed my body. One message read, "She's basically more of a roommate than a wife. Staying married just makes things easier." Another, "She won't ever leave. She's too dependent on the kids." And the worst, "If she ever tried to date, I'd shut that down fast. She's not built for that kind of attention." I sank onto the stool, the laundry spilling onto the floor. This wasn't just neglect, wasn't just betrayal, wasn't even just arrogance. It was cruelty, calculated, intentional. He didn't just cheat. He kept me emotionally starved because it benefited him. In that moment, something inside me didn't just shift. It locked into place with crystalline certainty. I deserve better. My children deserve better. And this man, my husband in name only, would not drag me down one day longer. The neutral voice that sealed my decision. Later that week, I met with a family counselor, a neutral party, someone who had no stake in my marriage and no reason to sugarcoat anything. After listening to everything, she said the words that changed my life. "You are already living as a single mother. Divorce won't break your family. It will only make the hidden truth visible. I broke down crying, not because it hurt, but because it was the first time someone had said it plainly. "You've been surviving," she added gently. "Now it's time to live." The decision. That night, sitting on my terrace with a blanket around my shoulders and the cool air brushing my face, I finally allowed myself to imagine a different future. A home without slammed doors. A life without walking on eggshells. Love that didn't require earning or proving or sacrificing myself entirely. I thought of Kathy, of her patience, her kindness, the way she looked at me like I was someone worth showing up for. I thought of my boys, how much better an example I could set by choosing myself, finally. And when I closed my eyes, I saw the path ahead of me. I would leave. I would divorce him. I would reclaim the life I'd lost, and I would not look back. For the first time in 10 years, the future didn't terrify me. It called to me. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a building collapsing beam by beam, predictable, unstoppable, inevitable. The morning I told Daniel I was filing for divorce, there was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no slamming doors. I think that shocked him more than any rage could have. "We're done," I said simply. Legally, emotionally, completely. He blinked at me, confused, like the idea had never truly occurred to him. "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed. "We've lived like this for years. Why change anything now?" Because I am no longer the woman who tolerates being erased. Because I finally remembered what self-respect feels like. Because I found someone who showed me I'm allowed to want joy. He didn't say those words, but some part of him understood. His expression shifted. Disbelief, then irritation, then something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing control. The family reaction. His parents were the first to know. When Daniel told them, they didn't rush to comfort him the way he expected. His mother sighed. "She gave you more chances than you deserved." His father shook his head. "You should have fixed this 10 years ago." For a man who had grown used to being praised, their disappointment cut deeper than any consequence. The community facade cracks. In the weeks that followed, the carefully curated image Daniel presented to friends and colleagues began to crumble. People started asking questions. Why was I moving out of the house? Why had we lived separately for so long? Why were the kids choosing to spend more time with me? Whispers spread. Stories resurfaced. The truth leaked through cracks Daniel couldn't patch fast enough. The women he'd once bragged to, the ones he assumed would protect his ego, turned silent when asked about him. Some even apologized to me quietly, admitting they hadn't known he was married. Others stopped responding to his messages. His options dried up in real time. It wasn't revenge, it was natural consequence. The persona he built, the charming counselor, the attentive father, the enlightened man unlucky in love, collapsed under the weight of evidence he himself had created. Custody and the kids. The boys were the pivot point of it all. When they told Daniel they wanted to live primarily with me, I expected anger. But what came instead was disbelief. "Why would you choose her over me?" he demanded. The answer was simple. "Mom doesn't yell," my younger son said. "Mom listens," my older added. "Mom is happy," the younger whispered, like it was a secret. Daniel stared at them as if their words were a betrayal, unaware that the true betrayal was his neglect. The mediator signed off on their choice. The counselor supported it. The legal system upheld it. And for the first time in years, I watched Daniel truly lose something he wanted to keep. His attempts to sabotage. Desperation makes ego dangerous. He tried new tactics. Emotional guilt. "You're breaking our family for a fling." Dismissal. "You won't last with her. Women like you never do." Projection. "You're the one who ruined this marriage." Manipulation. "Think about the kids. They need both parents under one roof." But none of it worked, because this time I wasn't listening out of survival. I was listening out of clarity. Finally, when nothing else got a reaction, he tried attacking Kathy. He cornered her at her apartment while I was out of town, lied about me, lied about our relationship, twisted history, twisted motives. He thought he could scare her away. Instead, Kathy told him calmly, "If you respected your marriage, you wouldn't have broken it. If you respected her, you wouldn't behave like this now." It was over for him in that moment, and he knew it. The social unraveling. By the time the divorce papers were processed, Daniel wasn't the composed, confident man he once pretended to be. He was isolated, humiliated, exposed. Co-workers kept their distance. The school where he counseled quietly reassigned some of his responsibilities. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Friends he relied on stopped returning calls. His dating pool vanished as fast as it had once flourished. And the most damning consequence? He was alone in the house he fought to keep. The same house full of ghosts he created himself. My exit. When I moved into my new place, a warm, light-filled home, where every room felt like possibility, Kathy was there helping me arrange furniture. The boys ran through the halls, choosing their rooms, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in years. I stood in the middle of it all, with tears in my eyes, realizing I wasn't escaping Daniel. I was reclaiming myself. The divorce didn't just free me from a man who harmed me. It freed me from a decade-long version of myself who believed I had no choice. When I left the old house for the last time, Daniel stood on the porch watching us go. His expression wasn't angry, it wasn't sad, it wasn't even proud. It was empty, the same emptiness he once carved into me. Except now, it belonged to him. The first morning in my new home, I woke before the sun. Not from anxiety, not from footsteps downstairs, not from the weight of a decade-old dread pressing against my ribs. I woke because the silence was peaceful, soft, mine. I made coffee in a kitchen that didn't hold memories of whispered arguments or women's laughter drifting through the floorboards. I opened curtains that faced no part of a house where I once stood crying quietly, hoping the boys wouldn't hear. I watched sunlight spill across floors that had never witnessed heartbreak. For the first time since my wedding day, I felt like I was stepping into a life I chose. The boys adjusted better than I expected. They filled the house with noise and joy and sibling arguments about whose turn it was to pick a movie. They decorated their rooms with posters and Lego towers and little pieces of themselves, claiming space as naturally as breathing. And Kathy, steady, kind, deeply patient Kathy, fit into this new life in a way that felt effortless. She cooked dinner with us. She helped the boys with school projects. She sat on the couch with me at night, our knees touching, our hands intertwined. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. One evening, while we were all baking cookies, my older son looked up at me and said, "Mom, you laugh more now." I nearly cried, because he was right. I wasn't just free from Daniel. I was free from the version of myself that tolerated pain so quietly the world mistook it for strength. The final meeting. The last chapter with Daniel came without drama. We met at a quiet cafe the week after the boys officially switched primary residence. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but spiritually, like he'd finally realized the life he clung to wasn't going to be restored. He apologized. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't enough. But it was honest. He told me he never thought I'd leave. He told me he mistook endurance for acceptance. He told me he convinced himself I didn't feel pain because he didn't want to face the cruelty of his choices. "It wasn't that I didn't love you," he said softly. "It's that I didn't respect you, and now I know the difference." I nodded. Not to forgive him, but to close the door gently, without slamming, without bitterness. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "Can I have a hug?" he asked. It had been a decade since we touched without venom or obligation. I agreed. It wasn't reconciliation, it was release. A farewell to a version of my life that needed to end. The lesson. Healing didn't arrive like a revelation. It arrived in small moments. Kathy brushing my hair behind my ear. The boys laughing on the couch. Me dancing in the kitchen alone while cleaning. Waking up without dread. Sleeping without nightmares. Breathing without effort. It arrived slowly, patiently, the same way pain once had, but this time, building instead of breaking. And if there is one lesson I carry from all of this, one truth I want to give to anyone listening to my story, it's this. You cannot save a relationship by sacrificing yourself. You cannot raise children in a home built on silence. You cannot love someone into valuing you. But you can choose yourself. You can rebuild. You can find joy again. And when you do, the world becomes wider, brighter, fuller than you remembered it could be. The marriage died 10 years before the divorce. But I didn't. I was still alive beneath the wreckage. And now, finally, I am living. Not as someone's wife. Not as someone's fallback. Not as a ghost in my own home. But as myself. A woman who walked through hell and came out carrying her children, her dignity, and a love that feels like a new beginning.